Tonight, for our bedtime story, we're going to read Mr. Impossible. Mr. Impossible could do the most amazing things. For instance, Mr. Impossible could jump over a house. You try it. It's impossible. And Mr. Impossible could make himself invisible. All he had to do was stand there and think about becoming invisible. And he became invisible. You try it. It's impossible. And Mr. Impossible could fly. All he had to do was stand there and flap his arms, and off he flew. You try it. It's impossible. And Mr. Impossible lived in an impossible-looking house. Have you ever seen a house in such an impossible place? Of course not. One day, Mr. Impossible was out walking in the woods when he met a boy named William. William was on his way to school. "Hello," said Mr. Impossible. "Hello," replied William. "I'm William." "I'm impossible," said Mr. Impossible. "Really?" said William. "Really," said Mr. Impossible. "Can you do impossible things?" asked William. "Haven't come across anything I couldn't do," replied Mr. Impossible modestly. William thought. "Can you climb up that tree?" he asked, pointing up the biggest tree in the woods. "I can do better than that," replied Mr. Impossible. "I can walk up that tree." And he did. William thought again. "Can you stand on one hand?" he asked. "I can do better than that," replied Mr. Impossible. "I can stand on no hands." And he did. "That's impossible," cried William. "True," replied Mr. Impossible. Then William remembered that he was on his way to school. "Why don't you come with me?" he asked. "But I've never been to a school before," Mr. Impossible said. "Then it's time you go to one," replied William. "Come on." William and Mr. Impossible sat at the back of the classroom with all the other children. The teacher came in but didn't notice that there was somebody extra in his class that morning. "Good morning, children," the teacher said. "I have a very difficult problem for you to do today. It will take you most of the morning to work out the answer." And he wrote the problem on the blackboard. It really was the most difficult problem William had ever seen in his whole life, full of multiplications and divisions and additions and other things William didn't enjoy. The teacher was right. It would indeed take most of the morning to work out the answer, if not most of the afternoon as well. Mr. Impossible whispered in William's ear. William put up his hand. "Yes, William," said the teacher. "Is there something about the problem you don't understand?" "Sir," said William, "is the answer 23? The teacher was very, absolutely, totally, completely amazed. "How did you work out the answer so quickly?" he gasped. "It's impossible." "Nothing is impossible," said Mr. Impossible from the back of the class, and stood up. "Well, I never!" exclaimed the teacher. After that, Mr. Impossible spent all day at the school. He showed the teacher how he could read a book upside down. "That's impossible," said the children who were watching. "Absolutely," replied Mr. Impossible. Then William asked Mr. Impossible if he would like to play in the school soccer game. "Oh, yes, please," replied Mr. Impossible. "I've never played soccer before." And do you know what he did? He kicked the ball so high into the air that when it came back down it had snow on it. What an impossible thing to do. Then it was time to go home. Mr. Impossible said goodbye to all the people at the school, and then said goodbye to William. "Goodbye, Mr. Impossible," said William. "Goodbye, William," said Mr. Impossible, and just disappeared. William rubbed his eyes and went home. William's mother and father were waiting for him. "Hello, William," they said. "Did you have a good day at school?" "Yes," replied William, "and I met somebody who can do anything in the world." "Really, William," they both laughed. "You're impossible." William smiled and went inside. And 100 miles away, a small figure was listening to what William's mother and father were saying, and he grinned an impossible grin. and then he went to sleep, standing on his head. And we all know that's impossible.